Hi there, everyone. Good afternoon for those of you in the UK. Good morning if you're further west, or good evening if you're further east. Welcome to this CECAN webinar. This is one of several webinars we're having for individual papers from a special issue that CECAN was lucky enough to produce and publish in January. I'm Pete Barbrook-Johnson, myself and Corey Schimpf and Brian Castellani are going to be talking about our paper, Case-Based Modeling and Scenario Simulation for Ex-Post Evaluation. A bit of a word salad, but I think hopefully all the words that are important are in there. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes. You hopefully should be able to see a Q&A box somewhere in your Zoom window that's popped up. Please, please, please do put in any comments or questions you have during the session in there. We're going to be doing a little bit, almost asking you a bit of homework as we go. We'll be asking you to give us some of your thoughts on particular questions we have. And then, yeah, at the end, we have 20 minutes. We have plenty of time to have a little chat. If there's something really interesting that we'd like to get more information from you, I think we do have the technology, the ability to unmute you and ask you to say a bit more, but I think we'll only do that if there's something really burning. So don't worry too much about that. So yeah, do use the Q&A box to send in your questions. Before I start, I just wanted to say very briefly something on CECAN. CECAN's been running for 5 years now, so we've been doing quite a lot. There's a lot of good stuff on our website. The website's there in front of you, cecan.ac.uk. There's lots of papers, there's lots of reports, there's lots and lots of videos of recordings of webinars like this. There's courses that are upcoming and much more. So do check that out. Follow us on Twitter. Anything that's to do with complexity or policy analysis or environmental policy, food, energy, water, I'm sure there's something CECAN's done which hopefully is of interest. So yeah, this session, we are going to be talking about case-based modeling and scenario simulation. Hopefully the slide will tick on for me in a moment. There we go. This is really work that Corey and Brian started before I was lucky enough to meet them and work with them, developing approaches, really accessible approaches to case-based modeling, and implementing them in a web tool, a website, and thinking about how they can be of use to people who actually have practical problems, people in government, people in NGOs, maybe students or early career researchers who want to get to grips with some of these methods, but maybe find them a bit overwhelming or not sure where to start. So this is just another thread in that body of work, and we'll allude to some of that previous work as well. We're really lucky that we've been supported by CECAN. The rest of the team in CECAN have been hugely supportive, so a big thank you to them and the ESRC, obviously our CECAN's funders. I think it'd be remiss of Corey, me and Brian not to say thank you to our various employers as well for giving us the time and space to do some of this stuff, even when it maybe doesn't align perfectly with what our day jobs are meant to be. So Brian's a professor at Durham. I'm based at Oxford, and Corey's assistant professor at University of Buffalo. So big thanks to them too. Okay, so I'm gonna waffle on a little bit more, setting the scene. Then Corey's gonna really dive into what we mean, why we bother with this case-based modeling and scenario simulation, what was the motivation behind some of the paper. Then Brian's gonna, we're putting him where he's earning his money's worth as a professor. He's gonna give us the real detail on like how you actually do this, how you use this tool easily. It's not to go into gory detail, but give us a sense of how to do it in a practical way. Then back to me and Corey. In the paper, we talked through 4 examples of where we think this could be useful using published evaluations. We're going to talk through 2 of those today. Then Corey's going to talk us through some of the reflections we've had from this work. And then, yeah, as I say, a Q&A. So the more questions we get, the more interesting that will be, I think. So yeah, as I mentioned briefly right at the start, there is this special issue of the journal Evaluation. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the journal. The special issue was published in January, so it's not completely out of date yet, only a few months old, and it overviews a lot of the work that's gone in CECAN. Not all of it, but a decent chunk of it. And it's really, the idea is to really put a practical, kind of hard-nosed, pragmatic edge on understanding what complexity means for evaluation and how we go about using the ideas and methods of complexity and evaluation. There's a really nice, I'm completely biased, but there's a really nice editorial, I think, overviewing the use of complexity and evaluation. And then there's a bunch of different papers, some methods, for some very methodsy ones, and some more reflection-y pieces from our work. And so yeah, do check that out. One of the specific papers is the one we're talking about today, case-based modeling and scenario simulation. And for me, the real high level motivation is that we know there's this thing called case-based thinking or case-based methods, which is quite a broad family of different things, but all have in common to look at things in terms of a holistic case rather than individual variables. And that's really good and really useful. There's also this idea of scenario analysis and what if questions that we use a lot in all sorts of different settings. And it's bringing those together, but it's not just bringing them together to apply in research. It's bringing them together in ways that are easy to use, that allow us to explore any data we might have in a easy way, and we can quickly generate plots and pictures and things, but we don't do that in a kind of flippant way where we just produce something I don't really know what happened. We do it easily, but in a way that tries to force us to think, and we go backwards and forwards between different plots and outputs, and really question what these things that we have easily produced are. And so the idea is that there's an ease of use, but there's also forces us to think a bit. Just waiting for the slide to tick on. Maybe Corey, you could jump over if there's a bit of a delay on the slide. Thank you. So the software that implements all of this is called Complexit, just to give a name that you can mix up with all the other word salad we have in the title. So Complexit is the piece of software. There's the link there. It's on Brian's website. It's on the CECAN website. That's browser based. You can download it and play around with it. It's underneath it runs in R. There's an R shiny front for those of you who are interested in R and can use that. We're not going to go into a huge amount of detail on that today because we have already done a webinar on Complexit. If you go to the CECAN website, there's videos there. You don't have to scroll far till you'll get to the webinar on the detail of Complexit, but do have a go. There's loads of resources on there, and really that should be usable on its own. You don't need someone to walk you through that, really, hopefully. Next slide, please, Corey. So yeah, just to kick us off really on what we mean by case-based scenario simulation. As I said, it's this bringing together of a case-based approach, thinking about problems in terms of a holistic set of factors and variables at a case level, whatever we decide a case level is, whether it's a person or an organization or a local authority or a country, but defining in some sense some level of a unit of analysis and thinking about the things that make that up in a holistic sense, not looking at individual variables alone or across multiple cases or individuals, and combining that approach with scenario analysis. What we've done is just one way of combining those. This is one particular way of combining those. There will be others that you might be able to come up with. And the idea is that this thing helps us, like I say, think in cases. One of the main tools helping us to do that is to use cluster analysis and think about the way cases group together with these combinations of factors or variables that make them up. So that clustering idea is very, very key to how we think about cases. But then going one step further and saying, well, how sensitive are the outputs of these different types of clustering to changes? Are my clusters robust? Do I think they're good? If I nudge this thing, does the clustering change? And really starting to do these kind of what if type questions with the clusters that the analysis shows us might be there in our cases. So there's the cases to start off with, then they might cluster in different ways, and then we want to really push and prod and kick the tires on those clusters and ask, are they reasonable? What happens if things change? The big caveats, I think the things we've had in the past that people have quite rightly not quite been sure what we were talking, whether we meant this or not, is we're not trying to say that there's any causal analysis going on here. We don't represent causal mechanisms. We're just questioning the clustering, the associations that the different types of clustering analysis give us. And we're not really doing any kind of forecasting in a traditional sense. We're focused on, questioning how cases cluster. Next slide, please, Corey. So yeah, I did promise there would be a little bit of homework. This is it. So these are the questions. I think they're probably quite self-explanatory why we're interested in these questions. But we're really keen to understand how approaches like this can be made easy to use and easy to understand, and how we best communicate that and how we do that. So the big first question is, what is not clear about what we're talking about? You might already have some questions from my first introduction. What are you on about? I don't understand what you mean by this bit or that bit. That's one big question we have. Second one is slightly more positive question. I think as we go through, you might start to get a sense of where you think these types of approaches can be used. We'll talk through 2 examples, but if there are others, we'd be really keen to hear what your thoughts are on that. And then lastly, another slightly more, how can we be better type question about the barriers. So, we hope these tools, this approach is easy to use. We hope the Complexit website is easy to use. What might be the barriers that will stop you from using it? You've bothered to show up to this webinar or listen to a recording of this webinar. What's going to stop you from using this? So we'd love to have your feedback on that. So what we'd like to suggest is, if you throughout, starting from now, please feel free to put any thoughts on any of those 3 points or all of them, put some of those in the Q&A. And as appropriate, we'll pick up on those at the end and talk through some of those. So yeah, do put those in the Q&A. Next slide, please, Corey. So that's me.
I think this is when I'm taking over, right, Pete?
That's me done. So over to you, Corey.
Okay, thank you, Pete. Thanks for the great introduction to this. So I'm going to go a little bit more into why would you use this approach, and then we'll go into a little bit of how would you actually use it, and Brian will take over at that point. There's a little bit of a delay. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So why would you use this approach? I've abbreviated here case-based scenario simulation as CBSS, just so you don't have the long word salad as Pete was talking about. As many of you know, as you've been interested in CECAN or been coming to talks like this, we exist, or we live in a complex world. Our social systems are sort of interrelated. A change in one aspect may affect many other things. And that's sort of inevitable. Any sort of change we make, any intervention, any policy we're evaluating is going to bump into that problem. But how do we make sense of that? In particular, I think the sort of case-based approach is, how do we make sense of different groups and how different groups may respond to an intervention? And that's really one of the strengths of this approach. Here it says, CBSS enables the identification of subgroups. So if there's been some sort of intervention or there's been some policy that's been implemented to some group, you can use this approach to identify what might be those different subgroups within that population, or within that, whoever was impacted. Who are those different groups? What do they look like, in terms of different measurements, in terms of things like health or income or other attributes like that. As well, if you have sort of more longitudinal data, if you have data at multiple points in time, you might be able to pull out some trajectories. What happens with these different clusters as we look at them over time? Do we see changes with them? What do those changes look like? Are some subgroups becoming more alike? Are they becoming more dissimilar? Oftentimes we might be implementing some kind of policy or intervention to try to make some group improve their situation, or make that group of cases improve. As well, as Pete was kind of hinting at, the sort of scenario simulation added to this kind of allowed for more exploration of sort of what if situations. What if a different kind of thing was implemented, a different kind of policy was implemented? Would that push this group to be in a slightly different direction? And that can really give you sort of a broader picture, or at least allow you to explore what would happen if things were slightly differently. Since we often don't have that opportunity, we're operating in the real world, we put a policy out there, we have to see how people react. We have to see how it plays out in whatever system that is. In addition to that, another sort of why to use this approach, or what does it bring for me? It's pretty synergistic with realist evaluation. Sort of the big question of how does this work for, or what works for whom and in which ways. So in particular, looking at those different subgroups, looking at differences between them, looking at differences in how they respond over time to different policy or program. This approach is sort of well aligned with that. A point I do want to really emphasize as well is we're not introducing this approach to be like, oh, well, you've used these other methods already, forget all that, just use, CBSS, just use case-based scenario simulation. Instead, we really see it as a very sort of pluralistic approach, that it isn't there to sort of come in and replace what you've already done, but can help extend and complement the kinds of studies you've done or the kind of ways you've already sort of looked at some current evaluation data. So it's meant to be like, and then, extend what you've already done. And hopefully the cases we talk about, the evaluation studies we talk about a little bit later, kind of give a feel for what that looks like. And I would say in general, this approach is intended to be exploratory. The platform Complexit is really kind of a learning platform, a platform where you can upload your data, you can try to find those subgroups, you can look for differences across them, you can run these different scenarios, really to learn more about your data, to learn more about what happened in that context, what might have happened if the situation had played out slightly differently. So that's some of the reasons to engage with this approach. I think that if I go to the next slide, we are moving on to how do I run case-based scenario simulation easily. So I'm going to mute myself.
Thanks, Corey. Could next slide, please. So as Corey and Pete have said, the goal here is to make case-based scenario simulation accessible. And to do that, we have created this web software, Complexit. Next slide, please. The key here, as Pete said, is we're not trying to identify underlying causal models. What we're really interested in is giving you a sort of a sandbox to play around to see how interventions might unfold for a given policy. So in that respect, it's very much in the vein of agent-based modeling and different types of simulation approaches. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is actually take you now over to the website itself and show you how that works. But this gives you a nice feel for it. You'll see when you go in, you've got the download version and the web version, as Corey and Pete mentioned. The web version is entirely user-friendly and set to go. For those of you who are more interested in actually using our studio, you can go ahead and download that version. The key, to go to the next slide, please, Corey, is that we have this opportunity to actually explore the work that we've done. So I'm going to take you over here. You'll see, so this is the Complexit website, as we just saw, and there are user resources available. As Pete said, we're going to just keep this at a very basic level, but we have tutorials, video tutorials, and PDFs that explain each part of the process in running Complexit. And as Pete said, we've already done a webinar on Complexit itself. So this issue down here is how to run the case-based scenario simulation. So there are videos that are on YouTube and PDFs that you can follow. Clicking on to Complexit, this is the actual software itself. The example we're going to use, given the fact that this is also part of the tutorials, is the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation. For those of you who are somewhat familiar with it, the Welsh Index provides a variety of information on income, employment, health, education, access to services, community safety, physical environment, including issues on air pollution as well, and housing. And what's nice is you get these visualizations of the various areas within Wales to see visually, the levels of deprivation, but you can also use the data. So what we're going to do for Complexit, just for tutorial purposes, is we're going to use that data. And again, that data is actually available on the tutorial part of the page. So Complexit is comprised of a series of tabs that you see down the left-hand side here. And it was built, it's a bespoke, basically, approach to things. We're not providing you every and all ways of doing things. This is designed specifically, as Pete said, for case-based modeling. And so you have the first tab, which is importing data, clustering, confirming with machine learning, the scenario tab here, which we'll be focused on today. You can do proper data forecasting, classification. We actually used Complexit in the Northeast when we were modeling COVID last spring, and it did a very nice job at such a rigorous level. And then finally, what's really nice about this is you can generate a report so that everything that you're doing as you're moving along is being dumped into this final tab. And then it's simply a matter of clicking this and you'll get your Excel files and everything else, visualizations that are part of the process. One key little point is the file does need to be a CSV, which is a version of Excel, basic comma delimited format. You see here, what's nice initially about Complexit is that you can, again, visualize the data. We wanted to make this accessible, easy, user-friendly, low learning curve on the front so that you could just get on with doing this type of work for policy analysis and applied research. So you see down the left, each of the authority districts in Wales listed at the highest authority district level. And then just to show you that you can even work with data that changes, this is a measure of income deprivation. The higher the number, the worse. In 2014, 2016. So each we've got a bit of change data. So you're thinking most policies pre-post, we have that type of data across. And what's nice in Complexit is you can actually add up the different columns and look entirely at your data, or you can even subset your data, which is very nice for doing the scenario simulation in case you want to look at specific subset. Now, I'm not going to get too much into the details again, but you are able to simply move over from the data and run a cluster analysis on the data. Scenario simulation for us, case-based scenario simulation, works with the clusters as a simplified approach to analysis. So here you see, you get the clusters. So you get, in this case, 4 clusters. You get the average score for each of the measures of deprivation that we're exploring for this particular data set. And then you get this nice thing that's called a silhouette plot. Shows you each case in the database and how well they fit within that particular cluster. And the closer they are to 1, the better the fit. So you see the average silhouette fit here is 0.49, which is reasonable. But you can explore this. And again, this is the idea of just how simple and easy it is to move around it. The F score on that previous one was 56, the pseudo F. The larger, again, it's measured, the better. It's an unstandardized measure. But you can see that a 5-cluster solution is a much better fit with the data overall in terms of the F. And you can explore these different cluster options. And again, the refinement there is an issue of what are you after as a policy analyst? How fine-grained do you want to go down? For the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to just stick with the 5 clusters. So again, you have each cluster and you have the average score for the cases in that cluster, which in this instance are the authority districts. Then we have the machine intelligence. This is what's called a self-organizing map. And what's nice about this is you can compare the solution that's achieved by the machine learning to your cluster solution. And again, nicely about the tabs is you can go back and forth and look at your data continuously, rerun things, move on to the next tab as well. So this is the real strength of Complexit, is the visualization opportunity here. In this case, what you have is you can do your observations, you have your cases. This is what's called a topographical map. The way it works is the machine learning will distribute your cases across this map based on how similar they are to each other and how different they are from the other cases. So in this instance, we can plot all of the authority districts, and what you get here is a number. So this particular case is case 22, and its cluster is cluster 5. And we can go back and look at the actual clusters. So cluster 5 has a reasonably high level of deprivation. Again, the higher the number here, the worse. Cluster 2s are worse deprivation. And again, you can sort of do this kind of comparing and contrasting, looking across your data to get a feel for things, and then visualizing it and seeing that, yes, you see down here cluster 3, as opposed to clusters 5 and 2, they're separated from each other quite well, which makes sense in terms of the actual data. So you see here, what's nice is that you sort of think of this line across as a z-score. So it's your mean, your average, and then this is how far they are above or below the particular average. So you see these are where you have your highest levels of deprivation, income deprivation, and over here you have your lowest levels. So again, once you play around with it, it becomes visually intuitive, and you can just start moving through data very quickly as compared to, say, having to go through statistical outputs in SPSS or other measures. And again, this can be used to corroborate. And again, this is also all outputted as statistical information as well. So again, the idea here is you're exploring your different clusters, and you see here, you've got highly unhealthy clusters over here, and your reasonably highly functioning areas within Wales across authority districts that are doing quite well. So then we move to the actual scenario simulation tab. The idea here is it represents that same grid that you saw here. So it's the same grid reproduced for your simulation. Now, as I said, we're not using the cases, but we're using the clusters. So you run the cluster solution and you produce it up. A nice thing, just so you don't have to go back and forth, we've actually got the 5 clusters reproduced here so you can look at them. So you see, for example, cluster 1, which is in gray, is located over here, and it has a reasonably high level of deprivation. The lowest level of deprivation, cluster 3, is located down here, and that makes, again, sense that the way the SOM works is it maps things based on not just similarities, but how different clusters are from one another. So what's the goal here? So as Pete said, it's not to build a causal model, it's to explore different types of policy interventions and strategies. So if we look, for example, at cluster 2, right, which is located right here, cluster 2 has a high level of deprivation, one of the highest levels. And from 2014 to 2016, it doesn't do much better. There is a slight decrease down, employment as well, birth weight, some degree down, all mortality rates roughly the same. We kind of sort of call this type of approach a modest approach to intervention. We're not obviously going to drive the cases that are located in cluster 2 with high levels of deprivation to cluster 3 with its extremely low levels of deprivation. Policy-wise, that's probably an impossible task. But we might be able to drive cluster 2 towards cluster 1 to a slightly better outcome. So you can go in and you can explore different options. So if this was the income in 2014, what if we were able to bring the income down a bit more? And we were able to slightly improve employment deprivation. Sorry there, it just bounced. Give it a second here, sorry. And so we wanted to try changing some of these as I did. We'll just do one for the purposes of demonstration so that things don't move around. You can rerun your cluster solution and begin to see, did that change in any way drive this cluster closer to what we were trying to get to? And you see, not so much. Now, that doesn't mean anything didn't happen in here. As Pete said, we're not actually doing a clustering solution. It's more the idea of trying different interventions. So perhaps we went down to, say, 15. Again, no movement yet. So perhaps we might think of some type of intervention over here as possible, and then run that. Still not seeing a lot of movement. So the question then becomes, as you move across, what sorts of interventions might you do in this particular authority district that would allow you to begin to move those cases in the direction of your intended goal? And it's very useful as far as a learning tool goes, because you can talk this through with policy makers, you can talk through with people doing public services, and systems mapping is also very useful for this. Part of what we have actually in the tutorial section is a systems map that's been built by Nigel Gilbert that you can actually use online, or another version is from Loopy, and you can explore how you think potentially different combinations of these factors could result in some type of movement. The other key too, which Pete brought up, is that sometimes you see that even with policy interventions, you may not get the change you expect. And this again is, I think, a very useful aspect. Most policy focuses on, yes, and the idea that this is how you get change. We do these policy interventions and lo and behold, the world will become a better place. We know in reality that's not necessarily true, so that even if you focused on driving down income deprivation, other long-term sorts of systemic types of deprivation or inequalities may still prevent that type of improvement from happening. You see that in the States, for example, where it's all about the economy, but we still continue to see poverty traps and real inequities around long-term health and well-being relative to income. Now, suppose you find the last step here, suppose you find a solution that you quite like. You can run what's called a sensitivity analysis as well, and then explore, if I have a solution, but what about some variance around that? We should sort of think of it as standard deviation. In the real world, that type of intervention is going to be messy. So you can run a nice sensitivity analysis and explore the parameters around your solution. And again, the details of that are explained in the tutorials, but then it gives you a real sense of, if I did this intervention, out of 1,000 times doing this intervention, what's the level of success? Is it 95%? Is it 45%? What's the likelihood that intervention would drive your clusters in the direction that you're going? Again, it's not causality, it's exploring different ideas. And really the ultimate purpose is to arrive at a greater understanding of your topic and how you might make interventions by working with people through the process of discussing this. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Pete and Corey to give you some more concrete examples of how we actually use this.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, I mean, Brian really nicely took us through the detail of the system. I think I can't emphasize enough the amount of effort that particularly Brian's put into those tutorials to help you go through. So do have a look if you want to look at those steps in a lot more detail. There's a lot hidden under the bonnet of what Brian's just talked us through. So yeah, in the paper we then have next slide, Corey, please. Then 4 examples where we try and basically go through and say, right, this approach all sounds nice. This year we can kind of geek out on some of these methods and have some fun with them. We can try and make them accessible, but what added value would they actually bring to evaluations that are happening in the real world? So we try and be sort of systematic about it. And we looked at published evaluations from the past. I mean, that's tricky to a certain extent in the first place. Not the vast majority of evaluations, I think, are not published in the end, even though we might hope they are. But we found a nice spread, I think, of evaluations that are published, and then look at what this approach and what using Complexit might have brought. We will just talk about 2 now, but in the paper we have 4 that spread across. There's 2 that are kind of learning or impact process evaluation type evaluations, where there's a kind of real trying to generate some new understanding and be reflexive and bring that into the next stage of the policy cycle, perhaps. So we have the Heat Networks investment project in the UK, and they're all of the examples are from the UK. Sorry, the Heat Networks investment project, which is run by BEIS, that's the energy department, and Then we have the Frontline Fast Track Social Work Program, which is a pilot program, which Corey's going to talk to us about in a moment. We also have the National Evaluation of Sure Start, which very big policy in the UK, lots of attention on that, a whole bunch of evaluations of quite high pressure to a certain extent. So we will stick away from that today. But first, yeah, I'm going to talk about that bottom left one there, the renewable heat incentive, which is a big budget burner for BEIS. They spend a lot of money on this. And think about how this approach might have worked. So yeah, I'll dive into that now. So if you can have the next slide, Corey, thank you. So the renewable heat incentive, or the RHI, as you may hear it referred to as, is basically a payment system for renewable heating. If you, in your house or your factory or your office building, heat that building with a renewable heat source of some type, and there are a few different ones out there, ground source heat pumps, for example, you get paid, that gets subsidized. And so yeah, it's both in domestic homes and in non-domestic properties, factories, offices, etc. This has been running for a long time. The last 10 years there's been lots of evaluations done. Those of you interested in this area will have noticed, will of course noticed recently the UK government had the Green Homes Grant, which was a similar policy designed to support energy efficiency and renewable heating in the home. But that was cancelled. That was introduced probably a year ago, and was cancelled within a year because of lack of uptake. So it's a it's a tricky policy area, I think. Next slide, Corey, please. The way that there's a bunch of different evaluations done on the renewable heat incentive, one of the key focuses throughout them is they really look at applicants and break those down into subgroups and look at how applicants have acted and how they've benefited from the policy. You can already start thinking about clusters. There's also a big focus on installers, but then also importantly, and I think this is common to quite a few policies, I've seen this in different evaluations, there's also a decent chunk of effort put into non-applicants. So who are the people or the organizations that we might hope would have benefited or applied to be part of this policy to get this subsidy, but maybe didn't. So non-applicants. Of course, there's a whole bunch of evaluation data that's generated specifically for the purposes of evaluating the different stages of the policy, but there's a lot of admin data as well, which can be useful, we can bring into our analysis. And for me, the big question I wanted to focus on is this question around non-applicants. Who are the applicants that could have been or should have been, in an ideal world from the policy owner's perspective, who could have applied and why maybe didn't they? So next slide, please, Corey. And so this is where, just to give you a sense of where you might bring in these different types of clustering and scenario analysis approaches. So for me, the first thing to think about is right, let's cluster our applicants and our non-applicants. We've got a whole shed load of data on them, who they are, what they're doing, if they applied, if they didn't apply. Where do they cluster on those types of factors? Are there groups and types of applicants? Are there groups and types of non-applicants? And is there any overlap in those? Are there groups of non-applicants that look very similar to applicants? Are there these kind of nearly applicants, as I've named them there? So that's the first kind of step in saying clustering and trying to look at subgroups. And I think to a certain extent that some of that work would have been done in different ways within the evaluations that have happened, even if it's not all reported. I'm sure they'd have thought about typologies of applicants and non-applicants. The next step, I think, is to then look at the scenario simulation and say, right, particularly with those nearly applicants, the same way Brian walked us through, if I change these issues in a particular cluster of regions in Wales, might they become less deprived? The question here becomes, okay, there's this group of nearly applicants. If they'd have been slightly different in this aspect or or another aspect, or if we'd have some other strand to the policy that could change something about them or help them in some way, would that bring them towards being an applicant? Would that bring them more close to being an applicant? What is that distance? How sensitive is that distance to being closed? And so the exact same way Brian walked us through with the different regions in Wales and seeing how stuck are they in some of these deprivation indexes. Do the exact same thing here with the nearly applicants. How close are they to being an applicant? What might need to change? And really, how plausible is that? For me, that's the real killer. It's not just, oh yeah, we could change them. Yeah, we could do this, this, and this, and everything would be fine. It's like, well, actually, now let's go through and really think about how plausible it is those things would happen. And I think, like Brian says, an often underestimated thing about complex systems is the fact that they don't change very much and they're very stable, and it can be very hard to create change. And I think evaluators actually are amongst the people who understand that best. Hopefully this analysis would really give a sense of that as well. And I think, again, as Corey mentioned right early on, the point is not you do this and it replaces what's happening, but you complement the work that is already happening. And I think the key place I saw in the Renewable Heating Incentive, there's a lot of effort put into customer journeys and of applicants and non-applicants. And I think it's about thinking where in that customer journey might those clusters tell us something about where we might intervene, or how we might bring those non-applicants to become applicants. So yeah, I'll stop there and pass back over to Corey.
Thanks, Pete. And good coverage on that. Thanks for introducing the cases. Let me go back here. So I'm going to talk through one of the other cases. This one was more a pilot study, really trying to try something out and learn from that. The Frontline Fast Track Social Work Training. So it was a program started in 2013, ran to 2017, really trying to train social workers as sort of a program. It was very practice-based. So focusing on getting sort of a practice-based, authentic educational experience in sort of doing similar work to what social workers will eventually do. So trying to raise up a new generation of high-performing social workers. And I think there was also within this program trying to prepare such future social workers to help particularly at-risk children. Again, like Pete said, this was another program that happened in the UK and was run by the Department for Education between those years. So a little bit about what did the evaluation look at. Again, more of a pilot type of study, trying to see what would come out of this, how effective was it. Some of the things the evaluation focused on was what kind of students did they attract to this frontline program. It was running concurrently with other existing social work degrees out there. The effectiveness of the program, how prepared were people who went through frontline as they went out to take a career in social work, how prepared were they for taking that on? And there was also some comparison between the frontline program and other existing programs. And so that's how this one falls sort of under the other dimension we talked about. It's quasi-experimental in that sense. They were looking at the effects of this program versus sort of the standard status quo for how social work education is normally done. They collected, as with many studies, a bunch of different data. This performance assessment there really has to like educational performance, how were students performing in the program, and also kind of looking at some of those. They were able to collect some data from other existing universities so they could do that comparison. They had some surveys as well, both of participants and comparison students, and they did interviews with the students themselves and various stakeholders, people running the program, instructors, just get a bigger picture of what was going on and what was effective about the program, what sometimes maybe didn't work as well, and what did or did not make it different from existing programs. So I think sort of in spirit of like what Pete was saying, like what's the big question here? I think a big question to sort of poke at a little bit more is sort of what was going on with the frontline program and what differences do we see with like what happened through that program, what students got out of it versus sort of existing social work programs. So if we were to think about case-based scenario simulation, again, that's something that complements what was already there, not is overriding what currently exists or was done in this context of this evaluation. In the study themselves, they did do some comparisons between frontline students and between students at other universities that had a social work program. They tended to do those comparisons to kind of high-level aggregate outcomes, a large education measure, how well do they perform on an exam, or like a practice-based assessment, and found differences, found that the frontline students tended to perform better But I think we could break that down a little bit more. We could take both the frontline students and the comparison students and try to cluster them. Part of the reason is there may be differences within both of those groups. For instance, there may be some subgroup within the frontline students who performed quite well, but there may be hidden in those averages, groups that perform more in the middle. So by looking at both of those samples and clustering them, we might be able to find more subgroups and get a more nuanced way at looking at just how many students and what sort of profile differences do we see in terms of their educational outcomes across the frontline students and across the comparison students. I think another thing that kind of goes into, the frontline program had a pretty big emphasis on practice-oriented education. So one of the big assessments they had was to have in the frontline program, to have students basically do like a mock interview, like an intake interview with someone as if they were, a practicing social worker. And then those are recorded. And then there was sort of a judge who was like a licensed social worker or several judges sort of rating how students were doing in terms of that. So very much focused on, authentic practice. But there were other assessments that were more sort of standard academic assessments about, students' ability to describe what social workers do and reflecting on some of the things they've learned. So in sort of this first cluster, we might think of several different indicators, those more performance-based ones that are like authentic practice, as well as more traditional academic measures. But to get a little bit deeper on like what exactly did the frontline program impact, we might recreate those clusters, but really focus more on just the sort of traditional academic kind of measures they had, these sort of reports and reflections they had students doing. And the reason for that is because the frontline program focused so much on practice-based education. Do we see the same sort of differences? Did that carry over in any way to other sort of more traditional academic measures, or do the frontline students and the comparison students look more similar when we look just at those more traditional measures? And that might give us a sense of, how far reaching was the sort of shift in educational focus for the frontline program. And another thing we may look at is, if we look at the scenario simulation, one of the things that stood out was, the students, when they were brought in, the frontline students were already fairly high performing relative to the comparison students. So we could use a scenario simulation here to sort of add a little bit of a weight to students, either weight up the students, like their background experience for the students who were comparisons, so they had a similar sort of baseline educational background, or bring down the frontline students. And that might be just one way to tease apart a little bit more the differences that we're seeing between the groups. Is some of that just explained by baseline differences versus, the actual effects of the program? And I'm going to move ahead because we're running a little low on time. We have So just as a refresher, these are the questions we wanted you to think about. I'm going to talk about reflections, I think, very briefly, so we can get to the Q&A, because we're already at only like 12 minutes left. But if you haven't yet shared, I saw a few people were sharing things. Just as you've been thinking through this presentation, as you've been listening to us, what is not clear about the approach or its value? Where do you think this could be applicable? And what barriers do you see if you were to use this? What barriers do you think you would have to applying it? So I'm going to just go through these pretty rapid fire. If you want to see more on like our reflections of this approach and sort of what we took away from looking at the different cases, I would encourage you to look at the paper. Someone asked if there's a publicly available version of it. There is on ResearchGate, and we can get that link to you. There's a pre-finalized paper, a draft, almost right before it was finalized up on ResearchGate. So I'll go through these quickly, but if you want to see more, I encourage you to look at that. So just broadly, we saw that the clustering, the scenarios, showed a wide range of potential for exploration and generating new kinds of questions. And we also saw some evidence that you could use this approach without necessarily discounting what had already been done in prior evaluations. It was complementary, in other words. I'm just going to skip this one. It gets into some details, but we'll move on. Kind of see as we were talking that CBS is well aligned with realist program evaluation. And finally, another, like the last set of our reflections really dealt more with thinking about what your cases are and kind of how do you do that in this kind of work. So there's some writing in there of like, it's important to decide kind of what your cases are, what scale they might be. They could be individuals, they could be organizations, and what factors or what measures do you want to include in there? And this can sometimes be a challenge if you run this cluster analysis, you run the SOM, and you see that, for instance, the clusters you get aren't stabilizing. You're getting all sorts of different like cluster solutions, or you see like the clusters you get are way out of line with the other kind of data you have. What that may suggest is you need to rethink of like what exactly my cases are, what should be on my cases. And one way to think about that may also be like theory of change or any experience you have to identify what those key factors are. And finally, more, there's always issues of data quality, but what can you do on that? So, apologize for running through that fast, but I want to get a chance to get to questions so we can return back to that.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this is the price we pay, I think, for CECAN allowing us to chair ourselves is we're a little bit overrun. So apologies for that. I think there's a bunch of questions that have come through. I know Brian's been typing some answers up as well as we go. I don't know if everyone can see those or not. I apologize for that, but there's still a few. I think do chuck in questions now. We've got 10 minutes. I think the first one I'm going to put over to you, Brian, and then I might jump on after you. But the thing is, you brought it up. This question about systems mapping. You mentioned the couple of tools we linked to from Complexit. How does this fit in with Complexit?
Yeah, so you can see if you go to the answered, I was just throwing up some answers just for sake of time to just make sure everybody gets their questions responded to, and some of them are getting a bit more down into the details of the nitty gritty of this. Systems mapping, the way we're thinking about this is Pete and other colleagues at CECAN do use systems mapping and have been pushing particularly the participatory systems mapping. The idea here is that if you thought about those clusters and you thought about the profile of factors that's within them, you would be asking people to sit down and actually think, how do they interrelate? Because if we are truly doing complexity, these aren't orthogonal factors. Income is not separate from employment, which isn't separate from education, which isn't separate from crime, and so forth. So the participatory systems mapping gets people to actually think, how do the pathways of change actually work? You can link it to your theory of change model, for those of you who do theory of change modeling. And it gives a way of really, again, not just sitting into the cluster and just pushing numbers and raising this and lowering that, but actually having a reason for that. And based on barriers to change, based on the things that you don't think you can accomplish, and then to see what the actual outcomes are. So the systems mapping is quite powerful. And again, as I said, Pete's been lead on that, and you might want to say a few things on that as well, Pete.
Yeah. I think my dream, my kind of end, I don't know if it's 6 months or 10 years down the line, depending on how much we prioritize it, is the next tab you go across to, or one of the tabs you can go across to, throws up at you a small systems map, a network of nodes, which are the factors, the variables in the data you've uploaded, and then either throws up some connections. There's lots of different methods out there to infer some of the causal connections from the data you upload. Those have lots of issues and problems with them, so we wouldn't want to just put them up and trust them, but actually have a process where we can change them and we can annotate them and we can muck about with them and add them and take them away. So for me, that's the end goal, is like actually put those variables up and start to connect them with arrows that we might annotate, we might color code, and it starts to look like some of the systems mapping we do. I think we haven't built in that functionality yet, but I think the tool that Brian mentioned, the systems mapper that Nigel has developed, allows you to do that. And, you know, that's all open and free and open source. And there's also another very popular one that I think is nice, but doesn't have quite as much functionality as Loopy. But no, I think for me that point, this is where that point of jumping between these different methods, making them easy, is the underlying motivation. So anything that can do that, we're up for bringing in. It's just a capacity question of adding them in. There was another question on agent-based modeling that came through, asking how can we elaborate on how we use that? I like this specific point. Are the cells in our clustering, are they the agents? And I think I'll just say a couple of words on that, because we are, as Brian mentioned in the answer that he wrote in, we are developing an agent-based modeling tab to Complexit. What that tab is going to do is really quickly, in a very dirty and quite naughty from a kind of agent-based modeling, you know, the pure science of it perspective, create an agent-based model and run it for you. And one of the first questions it will ask you to go from that, here's your data and here's the analysis you've done, to a model, the first thing it will ask you is like, what are your agents? Are your agents every case? Or are you modeling a case as a complex system, and within that case there are lots of individual agents? And so that's one of the first things we sort of put back to the user to ask them. And I guess we haven't got it at the moment, but we could absolutely say, could your case be a cluster? And do you want to break that out in a different way, or do you want each of your clusters to be a case? And I'm sure an agent, sorry, I'm sure you could think of reasons why that might be an interesting way to model the system. So absolutely, we're keen on that, and that's hopefully coming soon. We've made pretty good progress, I think, largely down to Corey's hard work, getting that ABM tab close to being to be ready. I think we have another question come through. I don't know, Corey or Brian, if you who wants to answer it, but I'll ask it. The question is, can this method be combined with other case-based methods such as QCA, especially in the case where you want to infer causation?
Do you want, I could jump in, Corey, then you could jump. Yeah, absolutely. We actually wrote a paper showing how case-based methods integrate into a variety of things, including agent-based modeling, computational. In this case, you could, without doing the participatory systems mapping, you could actually do a QCA and come up with your simple, intermediate, or more complex solution, you know, in terms of what the causation is, and then actually plug that into the scenario simulation and make those exact changes based on what the QCA is producing. And that would be another excellent way to explore it. To Pete's point, we want to definitely have a participatory systems mapping tab in there. And one of the other things we'd like to do is have the QCA in there as well, because both are driving this idea of causation in a way that the scenario simulation can't, but it would still be a way to explore what QCA is producing, particularly since a lot of QCA does not work temporally, tends to be a static analysis. So it's also another way of pushing back on QCA to think about doing more temporal types of analyses.
Yeah, I mean, I think as both Pete and Brian were hinting at, that was maybe part of the bigger, and hopefully this isn't too much of a tangent, but that was sort of the bigger picture of Complexit. Is we did focus first on case-based methods, and this scenario simulation kind of emerged out of that project. But really some of the initial motivation was there are all these different complexity appropriate methods out there, but it's not necessarily easy to always pick them up. You may have to, you know, go study a bunch of things to really sort of be able to use it. So can we come up with things that allow people to easily get using it, see what it does, get some feedback from that? So I think that's like, there is I don't know what the year takeaway is, how long it takes to get there. We are working on the sort of fast ABM, as Pete mentioned, but there is sort of a view of having like kind of a network of these different things, more sort of in that sense of how can you quickly use it? How can you sort of have something that's out there, be able to put your data in there, do this and get some feedback relatively quickly and have those talk to each other in some way.
Yeah. Thank you both. I think I'm conscious of time. I know we've overrun, but I don't think we should go past the hour because I'm sure people have got places to be. So I think what I'll do to wrap us up is, I think, you know, as it's hopefully quite clear, we're really interested in bringing in extra tabs and testing out the functionality and getting people's feedback. And, you know, we're doing that in different places, but we're always open to more and more. So I think if any of this is interesting, this particular piece we've shown today, please get in touch. We'd be really interested to work with you in applying it somewhere or getting some of your feedback. And I think if there's other methods you would like to see in there and you'd like to collaborate on that, I think that's absolutely things we're interested in exploring. We're a small team, so, you know, bringing in more people and ideas is, you know, part of how we'd like to work. So yeah, do let us know. Do shoot us an email with any other questions. The PDF is on ResearchGate. If you can't find that, email me. I'm very happy to send PDFs to anyone who wants them of the paper. But yeah, I'll draw it to a close there. Thank you very much, Corey and Brian. Thank you, CECAN and Gail, for making the webinar happen. And thank you everyone for attending. Hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone.